The woman in Proverbs chapter 31 was not a housewife. She was a CEO operating a multi-revenue enterprise, managing a workforce, acquiring real estate, and building generational wealth, centuries before the word startup existed. And the ancient playbook she followed contains business systems that most modern executives have never discovered. By the time this teaching reaches its final revelation, you will understand why this woman did not just survive her era. She engineered a legacy. Stay until the end. What you hear last will change everything. Here is what most people miss. The church has spent generations reducing this woman to a symbol of domestic virtue. She bakes bread. She is faithful. She is gentle. That is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because the same text that praises her character also describes her closing deals, managing supply chains, and reinvesting profit into land. The veil has been pulled over a blueprint, and today that veil lifts. She rises while it is still dark, not to make breakfast, to think. There is a passage in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 18, that almost no one preaches on. It says, "She perceives that her merchandise is profitable." That word, perceives, is not passive. In the original Hebrew, it carries the idea of tasting and testing, of a deliberate analysis. This woman ran financial assessments before the sun came up. She knew her margins, understood her cost of goods, and knew exactly what was working and what needed to be cut. That is not a soft virtue. That is operational intelligence. Now, here is where modern business fails its own people. Most entrepreneurs operate by emotion. They launch products because they feel excited. They hold inventory too long because they feel attached, and they overpay for relationships because they fear losing them. The Proverbs 31 woman operated by perception, by tested knowledge, not by trending sentiment. That distinction is everything. Look at her supply chain. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 13 says she seeks out wool and flax and works with willing hands. She does not wait for suppliers to come to her. She goes looking, evaluates material quality before committing resources, and only then commits. This is procurement strategy, exactly what a well-run manufacturing operation does today before signing a supplier contract. She was doing it in ancient Israel. And then there is verse 14. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. This woman had a reach that extended beyond her local market. She understood that the best value is rarely found closest to home, and that the willingness to go further than your competitors is itself a form of market dominance. Distance was not a problem to her. It was a sourcing advantage. Stop and consider what is actually being described here. A woman who sources raw materials across regions, processes them into finished goods, and sells those goods through merchant networks. That is a vertically integrated business with upstream and downstream control. That is not a housewife. That is an operator. Now watch what she does with her eyes. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 16 says she considers a field and buys it. The word considers is the entire story. She does not buy on impulse or on hype. She evaluates the opportunity, weighs the risk against the return, and when the moment is right, she moves decisively. Real estate has always been the ancient path to lasting wealth, not because land is glamorous, but because land does not disappear, does not go bankrupt, and does not lose relevance. Every generation that has held land has held power. But here is the wound that most people carry silently into financial failure. They see opportunity clearly, they sense the timing is right, and then they hesitate, waiting for perfect conditions that never arrive. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 3 says, "If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. When conditions are ripe, they release on their own schedule, not yours." The field she bought did not wait for her to feel ready. She studied it, and she moved. She also rose early, not simply to be productive. She rose early because the quiet hours before dawn are when strategic thinkers hear what the noise of the day drowns out. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 15 makes it precise. She rises while it is still night and gives food to her household and portions to her maidens. She is planning the day's work for others while most are still sleeping. That is not busyness. That is competitive advantage built through preparation. Before this teaching goes deeper, pause for a moment. Something in what you are hearing right now is landing. You can feel it. Drop a comment and tell the community where in the world you are watching from, because this wisdom has no borders. And knowing that someone in your city, your country, your time zone is receiving this same ancient revelation alongside you, that matters. Now let us go further. Here is where it gets practical. King Solomon, the wealthiest man in recorded biblical history, wrote Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 2 and said this, "Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, for you do not know what disaster may come upon the land." That is not a motivational phrase. That is a risk management directive issued from a man who had watched empires rise and collapse. He understood that concentration is the enemy of survival. 1 stream of income is a single point of failure. 7 streams is a hedge, and 8 is wisdom operating at full capacity. Now look at the Proverbs 31 woman through this lens. Count what she produces. She processes wool and flax, creates garments, even produces heavy woven fabrics for her home, manufactures linen sashes sold to merchants, acquires and operates agricultural land, plants a vineyard, and trades in the marketplace. By any modern definition, this woman had multiple revenue streams operating simultaneously. She was not diversified by accident. She was diversified by design. That is, Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 2 lived out in practice, centuries before Solomon framed it as a principle. And here is what she does with her profit. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 16 reveals the sequence. She considers the field, buys it, and then from the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. Read that again. She does not spend her earnings on comfort. She reinvests them into a new productive asset that will generate returns long after the initial labor is done. She is thinking in compounding cycles, not single transactions, asking not, "What can I afford today?" but "What can my earnings build for the next decade?" Most people break the cycle right there. They earn, they spend, they earn again, and they never stop to ask what their earnings could earn. The Proverbs 31 woman broke that pattern with a discipline that feels almost ruthless. She treated profit as seed, not as reward. And then there is the matter of her workforce. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 15 says she gives portions to her maidens. She delegates, assigns, and structures a team around her vision. This is not comfort spending. It is a strategic multiplication of her productive capacity. Every hour she redirects away from tasks that others can execute is an hour returned to the strategic thinking that only she can provide. The greatest limitation of every growing operation is not capital. It is the leader's inability to release control. She had solved that problem before sunrise. Now consider what this reveals about her real genius. She was not doing everything. She was designing the system that did everything. Her maidens executed, her merchants distributed, her fields produced. She sat at the center of a web of coordinated activity, and her role was to think, to evaluate, and to make decisions. That is the difference between a worker and a builder. The worker trades hours for income, while the builder engineers systems that build a legacy. If this wisdom is resonating, and it should be, this is a good moment to press the like. Not as a metric, as a declaration that ancient wisdom still works, that the system described 3,000 years ago in a single chapter of Scripture is more sophisticated than most business school curricula taught today. Her husband is known at the gates. Most people hear that and think it is a verse about wifely support. It is not, or rather, it is not only that. In the ancient world, the gates of a city were where commerce happened, disputes were settled, and contracts were witnessed. Reputation determined access. When Proverbs chapter 31 verse 23 says, "Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land," it is describing social capital built on the foundation of a well-run enterprise. Her operational excellence created the kind of standing that no amount of flattery could manufacture. Brand reputation is not what you say about yourself. It is what the market says when you are not in the room. This is where most businesses silently collapse, not from lack of effort, but from lack of coherence. The product is inconsistent, the service is unreliable, and the reputation becomes fragmented. The Proverbs 31 woman was obsessed with quality, not as an aesthetic preference, but as a strategic position. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 22 says she makes richly woven coverings for her home, and her clothing is fine linen and purple. Purple cloth in the ancient world was extraordinarily costly to produce, requiring rare materials and precise process control at every stage. She was producing premium goods and operating in the high-value segment of her market. That was a deliberate positioning decision, not an accident of taste. Now listen carefully. This is where Jesus Christ enters the conversation. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells a parable about 3 servants and a master who distributes resources before a journey. The first servant receives 5 talents and doubles them. The second receives 2 and doubles them. The third receives 1 and buries it out of fear. When the master returns, the verdict is devastating. To the first 2 he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and to the third, "You wicked and slothful servant." The resource was not reclaimed because the servant was poor. It was reclaimed because the servant refused to put what he had to work. This parable is not about effort. It is about deployment. The question God asks of every resource you hold is not, "Did you protect it?" The question is, "Did you multiply it?" The Proverbs 31 woman understood multiplication deeply. She received raw materials and turned them into finished goods, received earnings and turned them into land, received land and turned it into a vineyard. She never held anything in the ground. Every asset she touched, she activated. That is not hustle. That is faithfulness applied to economics. And here is the consequence of the opposite. The servant who buried the talent did not lose his master's trust simply by failing. He lost it by choosing fear over obedience. Fear is the real enemy of wealth. Not bad timing, not limited resources. Fear whispers that the market is too volatile, and that you do not have enough yet to start, that the seed in your hand is safer than the seed in the ground. The Proverbs 31 woman had made a decision, perhaps long before the text finds her, that she would not let fear manage her assets. She would let wisdom manage them. She laughs at the coming days. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 25 says she is clothed with strength and dignity, and she can laugh at the time to come. That is not optimism. That is the earned confidence of someone who has prepared thoroughly. She laughs because she has built systems that can survive what she cannot predict. She has hedged, diversified, reinvested, and structured a team. So, when the future arrives with its storms and disruptions and sudden market shifts, she is not caught exposed. She is positioned. Crisis management is not what you do when the storm hits. It is what you build before the clouds appear. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 3 says, "When clouds are full, they pour out rain." The rain does not negotiate and does not wait for a convenient moment. The only question is whether you built before the rain came or scrambled to build after it arrived. The Proverbs 31 woman built before. Her household was not a fragile structure dependent on ideal conditions. It was a resilient system designed to produce in every season. Now consider the depth of what she was actually building. Not just a business, a generational foundation. Abraham understood this language. When God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, he did not promise Abraham only personal prosperity. He promised a blessing that would extend to his descendants. The covenant was multi-generational by design, and the mechanism of that covenant was not passive waiting. It was faithful action compounding over time. Abraham moved when God said move, planted where God said plant, and the inheritance he built was not consumed in one generation. It flowed through time. The Proverbs 31 woman was operating in that same spirit. She was not building for today's comfort. She was building for the children who would inherit her systems, her land, her reputation, and her networks. Generational wealth is not a number in a bank account. It is a set of principles, disciplines, and productive assets that outlive the person who built them. She was transferring not just property, but methodology. That is the deepest form of wealth. And here is where charity enters, not as a distraction from wealth, but as a structural component of it. Proverbs chapter 31 verse 20 says, "She extends her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy." This is not described as an act that depletes her resources. It is described as an act that defines her character. And in the economy of Scripture, character is the load-bearing structure of all lasting prosperity. Proverbs chapter 11 verse 24 says, "One person gives freely, yet gains even more, while another withholds unduly and comes to poverty." Charity was not her expense line. It was her declaration that she operated from a posture of abundance, that her system was productive enough to overflow. Generosity is not the sign of having too much. It is the sign of trusting the system enough to release. There is a psalm that most people walk past without stopping. Psalm 112, verse 3. It says, "Wealth and riches are in his house, and his righteousness endures forever." Read that again. Wealth and riches and righteousness in the same house, in the same breath. The ancient world did not see these as opposites. It saw them as the natural result of the same root. A life lived in the fear of the Lord produces both, not one at the cost of the other, but both together, permanently. Verse 5 of that same psalm continues, "It is well with the man who deals generously and lends, who conducts his affairs with justice." Affairs, plural. He has multiple streams of activity, and every one of them is conducted with justice. This is the Proverbs 31 system described from a different angle. Same principles, same architecture, different face. The wisdom is not gendered. The blueprint is universal. And that is the final revelation this teaching has been building toward from its very first breath. The Proverbs 31 woman is not a historical curiosity or a cultural artifact from ancient Israel. She is a working model, a live demonstration of what happens when a person of faith takes biblical economic principles and applies them with discipline and consistency over time. Diversification, reinvestment, delegation, quality control, generosity, foresight. She did not build her enterprise in a single moment of inspiration. She built it the way all lasting things are built. One decision at a time, one reinvestment at a time, one early morning at a time. So what do you actually do with this? You stop waiting for a special moment to begin. The field she considered did not announce itself as the right field. She went looking. You stop consuming your earnings and start deploying them, because even small amounts moved with intention change the trajectory of a household over a decade. You build a team before you think you need one. You establish quality as a non-negotiable standard, not as a distant aspiration. You give before you feel comfortable giving, and you build every morning as if someone who has not been born yet is going to inherit what you construct today. The woman in Proverbs chapter 31 is not described as extraordinary. She is described as faithful. Faithful with her hands, faithful with her capital, faithful with her time, and faithful with her people. The outcome of that faithfulness, the reputation, the land, the legacy, the laughter in the face of an uncertain future, was not handed to her. It was compounded. If these principles are alive in your heart right now and you want them to stay alive, stay close to this channel. The ancient wisdom has not been fully uncovered. There is more. There is always more. May your hands find work that outlasts your years. May your fields be fruitful and your legacy be permanent. The Lord bless you and keep you, and may His face shine upon everything you build.